A confident liberal student set out to dominate the debate, mocking tradition and experience until Barron Trump countered with a response so powerful it changed everything, and what happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. The grand auditorium of Westwood University buzzed with anticipation, filled to capacity with students eager for the night's open debate session. The vaulted ceiling, adorned with classical murals, gave the space an air of prestige, while rows of polished wooden seats stretched toward the elevated stage. At the center of that stage stood Ivy Carter, a 21-year-old firebrand activist known across campus for her unapologetically progressive views and relentless takedowns of conservative perspectives. Dressed in a fitted black blazer over a slogan-emblazoned t-shirt, Ivy exuded confidence, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd as she adjusted the microphone. She had been waiting for this moment, and now the floor was hers. Taking a deep breath, she leaned forward slightly, allowing a dramatic pause before delivering her opening salvo. "Let's talk about who really controls our country," she declared, her voice ringing through the auditorium. "Let's talk about the outdated ideologies, regressive traditions, and out-of-touch decision-makers who refuse to step aside and make room for a generation that actually understands the world as it is today." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Encouraged, Ivy pressed forward. "The people in power, those over 50, cling to their faith, their patriotism, and their so-called family values as if they mean something in today's world. They built a society on privilege, oppression, and environmental destruction, and yet they still dictate the policies that will shape our future. That's why I propose something radical but necessary." She straightened, letting her next words hit with full force. "There should be an age limit on voting in public office. If someone won't live long enough to see the consequences of their policies, why should they have a say in them?" The room erupted. Some students cheered wildly, rising to their feet in applause, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to one another. Even Dr. Harrison, the esteemed professor moderating the debate, frowned slightly, gripping the edges of his notes. He had seen bold arguments before, but never one that so openly proposed the political exclusion of an entire generation. "Does anyone wish to present a counter-argument?" Dr. Harrison finally asked. The noise in the room began to settle, but no one stood. Ivy smirked, satisfied with her dominance. Then a single voice rang out, clear and unshaken. "I would." A hush fell over the auditorium as Barron Trump rose from his seat. The sudden voice cut through the tension like a blade, commanding attention from every corner of the packed auditorium. Heads turned sharply, and conversations died mid-sentence as Barron Trump, tall and composed, rose from his seat in the third row. Unlike the others who had shrunk under Ivy's firebrand speech, Barron showed no hesitation. His calm, deliberate movement set him apart from the restless energy crackling through the room. Dressed in a tailored navy suit with an open-collared white shirt, he exuded an effortless confidence, one that needed no grandstanding to make an impact. Ivy, still standing at the podium, arched a brow and let out a short, amused laugh, tilting her head as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She leaned into the microphone, her voice dripping with mockery. "Well, well," she mused, crossing her arms. "Look who decided to grace us with his opinion. Daddy's boy himself." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, scattered but present, fueling Ivy's smirk. Barron, unfazed, stepped forward with the kind of unhurried grace that commanded rather than demanded attention. He didn't rush to the podium. He didn't react to the insult. Instead, he simply walked, his polished shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor, his hands tucked lightly into his pockets. When he reached the stage, he turned toward Ivy, his expression unreadable, a quiet storm brewing behind his sharp blue eyes. He took a moment, allowing the silence to settle, letting the weight of anticipation build. Then, in a measured, unwavering tone, he spoke. "Thank you, Ivy, for your passionate presentation." His voice carried effortlessly, neither sharp nor forceful, but filled with an underlying authority that refused to be ignored. Passion, however, without wisdom is like a ship without a rudder, powerful but dangerously directionless. A small shift in the room. Some students leaned forward, curiosity flickering across their faces. Ivy's smirk faltered, just slightly, before she rolled her eyes and shook her head. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Spare us the fortune cookie wisdom. Let's hear your actual argument." Barron didn't flinch. He didn't take the bait. He simply adjusted the microphone and continued. "You argue that older generations are holding us back," he said evenly. "Yet you use the technology they created, the education they built, and the freedoms they fought for to make that argument." The crowd stilled. Even those who had cheered for Ivy minutes earlier were now listening, drawn in by Barron's quiet, steady confidence. Barron turned, letting his gaze sweep across the audience. "Before we dismiss an entire generation," he said, voice strong but measured, "let's first acknowledge the shoulders we're standing on." The room held its breath, caught between the lingering echoes of Barron's words and the sharp energy of Ivy's growing frustration. She squared her shoulders, stepping forward with a smirk that barely masked the tension tightening at the corners of her mouth. "Oh, give me a break," she scoffed, shaking her head as she gripped the podium. "You talk about standing on their shoulders as if that somehow erases the damage they've done. Let's be real, Barron. The people you're defending, the so-called builders of America, they've hoarded wealth, destroyed the planet, and left our generation to clean up their mess. Why should we honor them when they refuse to step aside?" Barron remained unfazed, his hands resting lightly on the edges of the podium. "That's an interesting argument," he mused, his voice neither mocking nor aggressive, but laced with the quiet confidence of someone who knew he had already won. "But let's break it down. You claim older generations have done nothing but exploit and ruin the world. Yet you conveniently ignore the fact that they are the same people who built the infrastructure you use, who developed the technology you rely on, and who fought for the rights you now exercise so freely." His gaze was steady, unwavering. "The phone in your pocket, developed by people now in their 60s and 70s. The medical advancements that save millions of lives every year. The product of decades of research by those same outdated minds. Even the social justice movements you champion, led by those who came before us, who faced real oppression, who didn't just shout for change, but fought for it, with real consequences." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some students, those who had cheered for Ivy's speech, were now shifting in their seats, thoughtful, uncertain. Ivy's jaw clenched, but she forced a sarcastic laugh. "Oh, sure," she sneered. "Let's just worship the boomers and pretend their mistakes don't exist. You're dodging the point, Barron. They're still in power, still making decisions that we have to live with. Shouldn't the people who actually have a future be the ones shaping it?" Barron tilted his head slightly, considering her words, before replying with quiet precision. "A future without the wisdom of the past is not progress. It's arrogance." He let that settle, then continued, his voice growing sharper. "You claim to fight for inclusivity, for fairness, for a better world, and yet your solution is to silence an entire group of people simply because they are older. That's not progress, Ivy. That's discrimination." Ivy's smirk faded. A visible shift ran through the audience. The debate had turned, and for the first time that evening, Ivy Carter had no immediate comeback. A thick silence blanketed the auditorium, the weight of Barron's words hanging in the air like an unshakable truth. Ivy's confidence, once unyielding, now wavered under the quiet strength of her opponent's argument. Her fingers curled around the podium's edges, her eyes flickering toward the audience, searching perhaps for validation, for some reassurance that the tide hadn't turned against her. But the shift in the room was undeniable. The same students who had cheered her calls for generational exclusion now sat still, their expressions caught between contemplation and discomfort. Barron let the silence stretch just a little longer, his measured control of the moment an unspoken declaration of victory. Then, with deliberate ease, he stepped forward. His voice, calm yet carrying the weight of absolute conviction, cut through the tension like a blade. "Ivy, let me ask you something," he said, his tone not condescending, not mocking, but genuinely inquisitive. "You stand here preaching about fairness, equality, and the need for a better future, and yet in the same breath, you advocate for stripping millions of Americans of their voices simply because they were born before you. Tell me, how is that any different from the very oppression you claim to fight against?" A visible flinch ran through Ivy's posture. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Barron pressed on, his presence now commanding every eye in the room. "You call them outdated, irrelevant, unworthy of making decisions for the future. But let's consider something. If your logic were applied across history, who would we have silenced?" He glanced toward the audience, letting the weight of his question sink in. Would we have told Martin Luther King Jr. that his voice no longer mattered because he was over 30? Would we have dismissed Thomas Jefferson's ideas at 50? Should we ignore Elon Musk, who is revolutionizing technology in his 50s, or the scientists working to cure diseases, many of whom are in their 60s and 70s? A hush fell over the room, the rhetorical force of his argument leaving no room for an easy rebuttal. "I'll tell you what's truly outdated," Barron continued, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "The idea that wisdom has an expiration date, that progress means erasing the past instead of learning from it. You don't build a better world by tearing down the foundations that made it possible, and you don't create a fair society by silencing those who came before you. That's not progress. That's prejudice wrapped in self-righteousness." Ivy swallowed hard, her bravado now visibly cracking. A few students exchanged looks, nodding subtly. The tide had shifted completely. Then Barron took a single step back from the podium, his final words sealing the moment. "And if you truly believe in inclusivity, then tell me, where do they fit in?" A beat of silence, and then the first slow clap rang out from the back of the room. The slow clap echoed through the auditorium, its solitary rhythm breaking the suffocating silence left in the wake of Barron's final word. Then another followed, and another, until the applause swelled into a wave of sound that filled every corner of the hall. Some students rose hesitantly to their feet, while others, still grappling with the weight of what had just transpired, remained seated, their expressions marked by the unmistakable flicker of reevaluation. The debate, meant to be a battlefield of ideologies, had instead become a lesson in humility, logic, and true inclusivity. Ivy Carter, the once unyielding firebrand, now stood motionless at the podium, her hands clenched at her sides. Gone was the smirk, the sharp defiance that had fueled her every statement. Instead, there was something new in her gaze, something far more vulnerable. An internal struggle between the certainty she had carried into the room and the doubts now gnawing at its foundation. She opened her mouth once, twice, but the words simply refused to come. Dr. Harrison, ever the neutral moderator, finally stepped forward, his usual authoritative presence softened by a quiet reverence for the moment. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured, careful. "Would you like to respond?" Ivy inhaled sharply, her fingers brushing against the microphone. But for the first time that evening, the response didn't come in the form of a biting retort or a defiant rebuttal. Instead, she exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging under the weight of realization. She looked out at the audience, not just at those who had cheered for her earlier, but at the ones who had been listening, truly listening, the ones who had been waiting for her to prove that she could do the same. She hesitated, swallowing hard. "I came here tonight believing I had all the answers, that progress meant leaving the past behind, That wisdom was something only the young could offer. She glanced at Barron, whose expression remained composed, yet unreadable, a silent invitation for her to continue. But I realize now that real wisdom isn't just about speaking louder. It's about listening, about understanding where we've come from before deciding where we're going. A hush fell over the room once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of tension or uncertainty. It was the silence of change, of an idea genuinely taking root. Ivy turned fully toward Barron, her voice steadier now. I may not agree with everything you said, she admitted, but I can't deny that tonight you gave me something I never expected, a reason to think differently. She extended a hand, and after a brief moment, Barron took it. The applause that followed wasn't just for a victory in debate. It was for the victory of understanding over division, wisdom over pride, and the quiet, undeniable power of truth. As the thunderous applause gradually faded, Barron Trump stood tall, his gaze sweeping across the auditorium, taking in the faces of students who had come expecting a debate but were leaving with something far more valuable, a lesson in perspective. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He had come here not to humiliate or defeat, but to challenge, to provoke thought, to remind those in the room that progress isn't about who shouts the loudest, but who listens the deepest. He turned back to Ivy, whose once unyielding confidence had softened into something more reflective, and gave a slight nod, not of victory, but of acknowledgement. Stepping forward, Barron adjusted the microphone one last time, his voice steady but carrying a quiet intensity that commanded respect, not demanded it. Every generation thinks they know better than the last, he said, his words slow, deliberate, allowing them to settle into the very bones of the room, until they grow up and realize just how much they still had to learn. The silence that followed was not empty but full of thought, of reckoning, of the subtle yet unmistakable shift that happens when one is forced to confront a truth they had long ignored. Dr. Harrison, who had spent years moderating debates, knew when a closing statement transcended the discussion itself, becoming something greater, something that would linger long after the students had filed out of the room. He said nothing, only nodded solemnly, an unspoken acknowledgement that what had transpired tonight was not just another university debate. It was a defining moment. A single clap broke the stillness, then another. And then, as if the entire auditorium had arrived at the same realization at once, the applause returned, this time not erupting in chaos, but rising in a slow, deliberate crescendo. Students who had once jeered now found themselves standing, not because they were choosing a side, but because they had been moved, challenged, changed. Ivy remained still, watching as Barron turned from the podium, his role in this moment complete. He did not bask in the applause, did not revel in triumph, but simply collected his things, moving with the same unshaken composure he had carried all evening. As he descended the stage, he passed Ivy, who hesitated before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "You were right." Barron paused, then without turning, responded just as quietly, "You will be too, someday." And with that, he walked out, leaving behind a room full of students who, for the first time, weren't debating, but simply thinking. The story of Barron Trump and Ivy Carter is more than just a debate. It is a powerful reflection on the importance of wisdom, respect for experience, and the dangers of ideological arrogance. In today's world, where generational divides and political tensions often create hostility instead of dialogue, this story reminds us that true progress is not about silencing voices, but about learning from them. Too often, the younger generation dismisses the past, believing that innovation can only come by tearing down traditions. But history has shown that wisdom is built over time, through experience, failures, and perseverance. Those who came before us have already faced struggles we have yet to understand. Instead of division, we need conversations where both young and old listen, not just to respond, but to understand. As we reflect on this story, ask yourself, are we truly open to different perspectives, or are we only willing to hear what we already believe? Share your thoughts. Do you think younger generations value the lessons of the past? How can we bridge the growing divide between youth and experience? Comment below and let's start a conversation.